On March 15, 1871, 12-year-old Violet Mueller spoke 3 words in broken English that would seal her fate. Herr Kellerman, burned children. The German immigrant community of Milwaukee's 3rd Ward fell silent. Johann Kellerman had been their most respected baker, a pillar of St. Michael's Church, a man who donated bread to orphans every Sunday. He had also been dead for 2 weeks, found frozen in the Milwaukee River under circumstances the police called an unfortunate accident. What no one could explain was how a barely literate German girl knew about a fire that had consumed a tenement building in Hamburg 7 years earlier, killing 6 children. A fire that Johann Kellerman had confessed to starting, in German, behind the closed doors of a confessional booth where only God, a priest, and one small interpreter were supposed to hear. Before we continue with the story of Violet Mueller and the deadly secrets that made her the most dangerous child in Milwaukee, the confession ledgers of St. Michael's Church were burned 3 days after Violet's death. The official cause was listed as accidental fire, but Father O'Brien's hands bore powder burns that he claimed came from cleaning his hunting rifle. Some secrets, it seemed, were worth destroying everything to protect. Milwaukee's 3rd Ward in 1871 pulsed with the rhythms of German immigrant life. Bakeries lined the cobblestone streets alongside breweries, filling the air with the mingled scents of fresh bread and fermenting hops. The neighborhood housed nearly 3,000 German immigrants, most of whom had fled economic hardship or political persecution in their homeland. They brought with them their language, their traditions, and their sins. St. Michael's Catholic Church stood at the heart of this community like a limestone fortress, its twin spires reaching toward heaven from the corner of Cherry and 3rd Streets. Built just 8 years earlier with donations scraped together by immigrant families, the church served not only as a place of worship, but as the social and moral center of German life in Milwaukee. Here, marriages were blessed, children baptized, and souls laid bare in the confessional booth. The church faced a persistent challenge that plagued many immigrant parishes across America: the language barrier between German congregants and Irish clergy. Most German immigrants spoke little to no English, while the Irish priests assigned to Milwaukee parishes rarely spoke German. This created a profound spiritual crisis. How could souls be properly shriven if confession could not be understood? Father Patrick O'Brien, the church's senior priest, had arrived from County Cork 5 years earlier with a reputation for strict adherence to canon law and an unfortunate tendency toward strong drink. Father O'Brien spoke excellent English and passable Latin, but his German extended barely beyond Guten Tag and Auf Wiedersehen. His younger assistant, Father Thomas Flanagan, was even less linguistically gifted. The parish desperately needed translation services for the sacrament of confession. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Mueller family, recent arrivals from the Rhineland who had settled in a cramped tenement on Huron Street. Heinrich Mueller worked as a cooper, crafting barrels for the neighborhood breweries, while his wife Greta took in washing to supplement their meager income. Their daughter Violet, 12 years old with flaxen braids and pale blue eyes, possessed an unusual gift for languages. Despite having arrived in America only 2 years earlier, she spoke English with remarkable fluency and could seamlessly translate between German and English with an accuracy that impressed even the educated men of the parish. Father O'Brien approached Heinrich Mueller in the autumn of 1870 with a proposition. Would they allow young Violet to serve as a translator during German confessions? The work would pay 50 cents per week, a significant sum for a struggling immigrant family, and would be performed under the strict supervision of the clergy. Heinrich, a devout Catholic who saw the arrangement as both financially beneficial and spiritually important, readily agreed. Violet began her duties in November 1870. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, she would arrive at St. Michael's just before Vespers, take her position in a small wooden chair beside the confessional booth, and translate the whispered admissions of guilt and sorrow that poured forth in her native tongue. Father O'Brien insisted on absolute discretion. Violet was to translate faithfully and immediately forget what she had heard. The secrets of the confessional, he emphasized repeatedly, belonged to God alone. The confessional booth at St. Michael's was an ornate piece of craftsmanship, carved from dark walnut and adorned with religious imagery. It consisted of 3 compartments: a central chamber where the priest sat, and 2 small kneeling chambers on either side, where penitents confessed their sins through wooden screens. The setup allowed for privacy, while maintaining the necessary acoustics for the priest to hear clearly. When Violet served as translator, she sat in a small alcove directly behind the priest's chamber, invisible to the confessing parishioner, but able to hear every word spoken. The arrangement worked smoothly for the first several months. Violet faithfully translated the typical catalogue of immigrant sins: small thefts born of desperation, lies told to employers, moments of anger against children, lustful thoughts about neighbors' wives. Father O'Brien would prescribe the appropriate penance, and Violet would translate the Latin prayers into German. The system seemed to serve everyone's needs perfectly. But Violet Mueller possessed a memory like a steel trap, a gift that would prove to be both blessing and curse. While she faithfully translated each confession and outwardly appeared to forget what she had heard, her mind retained every detail with crystalline clarity. Names, dates, locations, and crimes accumulated in her young memory like sediment in a riverbed. She never spoke of what she heard in the confessional, not to her parents, not to her friends, not even to herself. She simply remembered. The first crack in Violet's carefully maintained silence appeared on a bitter February evening in 1871. She had just finished translating a particularly long confession session and was walking home through the lamplight along Cherry Street when she encountered Mrs. Brunhilde Zimmermann, the neighborhood baker's wife. Mrs. Zimmermann was known for her kindness to children and often gave Violet small cookies when she passed the bakery. "Guten Abend, kleine Violet," Mrs. Zimmermann called out warmly. "How are your parents? I haven't seen your mother at market this week." "Sie ist krank," Violet replied, explaining that her mother had been ill with a persistent cough. The conversation continued in German, as it typically did between neighborhood residents. Mrs. Zimmermann expressed sympathy and offered to send some soup for Greta Mueller. "You're very kind, Mrs. Zimmermann," Violet said, switching to English as she often did when excited or emotional. "Not everyone in the neighborhood is so good to children. Some people hurt children and then act like saints." Mrs. Zimmermann looked puzzled. "Was mine too kind?" "What do you mean, child?" Violet's pale blue eyes took on a distant quality, as if she were looking through Mrs. Zimmermann rather than at her. "Some men give bread to orphans on Sunday, but burn down houses with children inside when they live in Germany. God knows everything, even when people think their secrets are safe." The words hung in the cold February air like visible breath. Mrs. Zimmermann felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She knew of only one man in their neighborhood who gave bread to orphans every Sunday: Johann Kellerman, her husband's business partner and closest friend. "Violet," Mrs. Zimmermann said carefully, "what are you talking about? Herr Kellerman is a good man. He would never hurt children." Violet blinked, as if awakening from a trance. The distant look in her eyes cleared, replaced by confusion. I don't know why I said that. I should go home. Mama is waiting." She hurried away, leaving Mrs. Zimmermann standing alone under the street lamp, her mind racing. The specific detail about burning houses troubled her deeply. How would a 12-year-old girl, who had spent most of her life in a small Rhineland village, know anything about fires in Germany? And why would she connect such knowledge to Johann Kellerman? Mrs. Zimmermann decided to speak with her husband about the incident. Wilhelm Zimmermann had known Johann Kellerman for 3 years, ever since the man had arrived in Milwaukee and established his bakery 2 blocks from their own. Kellerman was quiet, hard-working, and devoutly religious. He attended Mass every morning, confessed his sins regularly, and contributed generously to church fundraising efforts. The idea that he could be connected to any violence against children seemed absurd. But Wilhelm's reaction to his wife's story was unexpected. Instead of dismissing Violet's words as childish nonsense, he grew very quiet and very pale. Was it loss? Brunhilde asked. What's wrong? Wilhelm was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that warmed their small kitchen. Finally, he spoke. 3 months ago, Johann received a letter from Hamburg. He became very upset after reading it and asked me to help him write a response. His writing is not good, you know. The letter was from a man named Heinrich Brenner, who said he was looking for information about a fire that killed children in 1864. Brenner said he believed Johann might have information about how the fire started. Brunhilde felt her heart racing. What did Johann want you to write in response? He wanted to say that he knew nothing about any fire, that he had never lived in Hamburg, and that Brenner was mistaken. But Brunhilde... Wilhelm paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. I saw Johann's immigration papers when he first arrived. They clearly listed Hamburg as his previous residence. The implications of Wilhelm's revelation settled over them like a dark cloud. If Johann Kellermann had lied about his connection to Hamburg, and if Violet Mueller somehow knew about a fire involving children in that city, then perhaps the girl's strange words contained more truth than anyone wanted to believe. 2 weeks later, Johann Kellermann's body was pulled from the Milwaukee River. The official investigation concluded that he had slipped on the icy riverbank while walking home from the tavern, struck his head on a rock, and drowned in the shallow water. The police noted that Kellermann had been drinking heavily, making the accident entirely plausible. A tragic end to an immigrant's American dream, but nothing more. The funeral was well attended. Father O'Brien delivered a moving eulogy, praising Kellermann's devotion to the church and his generosity toward orphaned children. The entire German community mourned the loss of a man they considered exemplary. But as mourners filed past the coffin, 12-year-old Violet Mueller stood at the back of the church, her pale blue eyes fixed on the deceased man's face. After the service, as the congregation gathered outside St. Michael's, Violet approached Mrs. Zimmerman. Without any preamble or explanation, she said quietly, "He confessed 3 times about the fire, always on Friday evenings. He said he was sorry for the children, but that they were going to tell about the stolen money. Father O'Brien gave him 20 Hail Marys each time." Mrs. Zimmerman felt the blood drain from her face. "Violet, how do you know?" But the girl had already walked away, rejoining her parents as they headed home for dinner. She left Mrs. Zimmerman standing on the church steps, trembling not from the cold, but from the terrible certainty that Violet Mueller knew things that should have died with Johann Kellermann. The death of Johann Kellermann cast a long shadow over the German community of Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. In the weeks following his funeral, whispered conversations in taverns and shops began to focus not on mourning the man's passing, but on questioning the strange circumstances surrounding Violet Mueller's impossible knowledge. Mrs. Zimmerman found herself unable to sleep, haunted by the girl's precise words about confession frequencies and penance assignments. She had known Johann Kellermann for 3 years and had never once seen him enter the confessional booth on any day except Friday evening. His routine was as regular as clockwork. Arrive at St. Michael's at 7 o'clock, kneel in the left chamber of the confessional, and emerge 20 minutes later to kneel at the altar rail for extended prayer. The fact that a 12-year-old girl could specify not only his confession schedule, but also the exact penance he received, suggested access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Troubled by her growing suspicions, Mrs. Zimmerman decided to conduct her own quiet investigation. She began frequenting the church more often, observing the patterns of confession and noting which parishioners visited on which days. What she discovered deepened her concerns about Violet Mueller's role in the parish. The girl's position during confession sessions was more central than anyone had realized. From her small alcove behind the priest's chamber, Violet could hear not only the words being translated, but every aspect of the confession process. She witnessed the assignment of penance, heard Father O'Brien's advice and absolution, and observed the behavioral patterns of every German parishioner who sought forgiveness for their sins. In essence, she had become a repository for the darkest secrets of the entire immigrant community. Mrs. Zimmerman's investigation revealed another troubling pattern. Over the past 4 months, 3 other men who regularly confessed on Friday evenings had died under circumstances that, while not suspicious enough to warrant police investigation, seemed remarkably coincidental. Klaus Brenner, a brewery worker, had been crushed by a falling barrel in January. Otto Steinberg, a carpenter, had fallen from a church roof he was repairing in December. Heinrich Vollmer, a tavern keeper, had suffered a fatal heart attack during a card game in November. All 3 men had been relatively young, between 35 and 45 years old, with no known health problems. All 3 had been regular Friday evening confessors, and all 3 had died within weeks of Johann Kellerman receiving the letter from Hamburg about the fire. The more Mrs. Zimmerman thought about these deaths, the more convinced she became that they were connected. If Violet Mueller possessed knowledge of serious crimes committed by these men, and if that knowledge had somehow become public, then perhaps someone was ensuring that the crimes would never be investigated. Her suspicions were confirmed when she encountered Violet on a March evening outside Vollmer's former tavern. The building had been boarded up since Heinrich's death, his widow having sold the property to pay debts. Violet stood staring at the darkened windows with that same distant expression Mrs. Zimmerman had seen before. "He kept children locked in the basement," Violet said quietly, apparently to no one in particular. "For 3 years he kept children locked in the basement and sold them to men who hurt them. He confessed every Friday because he couldn't stop. But he couldn't stop because the money was too good. Father O'Brien told him to pray for strength. But Heinrich said the children's crying gave him nightmares." Mrs. Zimmerman felt sick to her stomach. The implications of Violet's words were horrifying, not only because of the crimes they described, but because they suggested a pattern of knowledge that extended far beyond a single confession about a fire in Germany. "Violet," she said gently, "how do you know these things?" The girl turned to her with those unsettling pale blue eyes. "I remember everything, Mrs. Zimmerman. Every word, every name, every sin. I remember Klaus Brenner talking about the workers he pushed into the vat of boiling beer because they discovered he was stealing. I remember Otto Steinberg confessing to murdering his brother in Germany to steal his inheritance. I remember all of them. But Violet," Mrs. Zimmerman said, her voice barely above a whisper, "those are confessions. They're supposed to be secret." "They are secret," Violet replied matter-of-factly. "I never tell anyone what people confess. But sometimes the words just come out when I see places or people that remind me. I can't help it." The girl walked away, leaving Mrs. Zimmerman with the terrible realization that Violet Mueller was not intentionally betraying the sanctity of confession. Instead, she was suffering from a psychological condition that made her unable to separate her vast accumulated knowledge of criminal confessions from her normal conversation. The secrets were literally spilling out of her, and each revelation put her in mortal danger from people who had killed to protect those secrets. Mrs. Zimmerman knew she had to warn someone about the situation, but she faced an impossible dilemma. If she told Father O'Brien that his translator was inadvertently revealing confessional secrets, Violet would lose her position and her family would suffer financially. If she told the police about the crimes Violet had described, she would be basing accusations on illegally obtained confessional information. And if she told other members of the German community, she might be signing Violet's death warrant. As March progressed into April, Mrs. Zimmerman noticed that Violet's spontaneous revelations were becoming more frequent and more specific. The girl seemed to be losing whatever internal control had previously kept her confessional knowledge contained. At the same time, Mrs. Zimmerman observed that several longtime parishioners had stopped attending Friday evening confession. Men who had been regular confessors for years suddenly began avoiding the church entirely or switching to Saturday morning sessions when Violet was not present. The German community was beginning to realize that their secrets were no longer safe, and someone was going to have to decide what to do about the girl who knew too much. Father Patrick O'Brien first noticed the decline in Friday evening confessions during the second week of April. For months, the German confession sessions had been consistently well attended, with 15 to 20 parishioners seeking absolution each week. Suddenly, that number had dropped to fewer than half a dozen, and those who did attend seemed nervous and rushed in their confessions. Initially, Father O'Brien attributed the change to the recent deaths in the community. Grief, he reasoned, could affect people's spiritual practices in unpredictable ways. Some might seek more frequent confession as a way of processing their loss, while others might withdraw from religious observance altogether. But as the pattern persisted, he began to suspect a more troubling explanation. The priest's suspicions were confirmed when Wilhelm Zimmermann requested a private meeting in the church sacristy. Wilhelm was one of the parish's most reliable members, a man whose contributions to church fundraising and whose regular attendance at services made him a pillar of the German community. When he appeared at St. Michael's on a Tuesday afternoon, visibly nervous and asking to speak confidentially, Father O'Brien knew something significant was wrong. "Father," Wilhelm began in his heavily accented English, "I must speak with you about the confession translations." "What about them, Wilhelm? Has young Violet been making errors?" Wilhelm shook his head. "No, Father. Her translations are perfect. That is the problem." Over the next hour, Wilhelm carefully explained what he had learned from his wife about Violet's disturbing revelations. He described the girl's specific knowledge of Johann Kellermann's confession frequency, her detailed awareness of penance assignments, and her apparent inability to keep confessional secrets contained within her memory. Most troubling of all, he shared Violet's claims about Heinrich Vollmer's crimes against children. Father O'Brien listened to Wilhelm's account with growing alarm. As a priest, he understood the absolute nature of confessional secrecy. The sanctity of the sacrament of penance depended entirely on the penitent's confidence that their sins would never be revealed. If word spread that confessions were being inadvertently disclosed, it would destroy not only the spiritual foundation of his parish, but potentially his entire career in the church. "Wilhelm," Father O'Brien said carefully, "are you certain about what your wife heard? Could the girl have been imagining these things, or perhaps repeating gossip she heard elsewhere?" Wilhelm's expression was grim. "Father, my wife asked me to investigate Heinrich Vollmer's property after Violet spoke about children in the basement. I went to his widow and told her I was interested in purchasing the building. She allowed me to examine the basement thoroughly." Father O'Brien felt his stomach tighten. "And? There are restraints bolted to the walls, Father. Iron shackles attached to support beams, sized for children. There are stains on the floor that look like blood, and there are scratches on the walls that look like they were made by fingernails." Wilhelm paused, his voice shaking. "No one could imagine such specific details, Father. Violet knows about these things because she heard Heinrich confess to them." The implications of Wilhelm's discovery hit Father O'Brien like a physical blow. If Violet Mueller possessed accurate knowledge of Heinrich Vollmer's crimes, then she likely possessed accurate knowledge of other confessed crimes as well. The deaths of Kellermann, Brenner, Steinberg, and Vollmer suddenly took on a more sinister aspect. Perhaps these men had not died from accidents or natural causes. Perhaps someone was systematically eliminating people whose confessed crimes had been compromised by Violet's revelations. "Father," Wilhelm continued, "there is something else. My wife believes that Violet's knowledge may have already spread beyond her family. Other people in the community are beginning to ask questions about the men who have died. Some are starting to wonder if their deaths were really accidents." Father O'Brien realized he was facing a crisis that could destroy his parish and potentially cost lives, including Violet's own life. If the girl continued to inadvertently reveal confessional secrets, she would become a target for anyone whose crimes she had overheard. At the same time, if word spread that St. Michael's confessions were not secure, it would undermine the spiritual foundation of the entire German community. "What do you think should be done, Wilhelm?" Wilhelm was quiet for a long moment. "Father, I think Violet Mueller should stop translating confessions immediately, for her own safety and for the safety of others. But Wilhelm, we need her services. Without translation, our German parishioners cannot properly confess their sins." "Father," Wilhelm said quietly. "I think our German parishioners' sins may be more dangerous than their souls can bear." That evening, Father O'Brien made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of dismissing Violet from her translation duties, he decided to test the extent of her knowledge. He reasoned that if he could understand exactly what she knew and how she was revealing it, he might be able to find a solution that protected both the girl and the parish. After that Friday's confession session, Father O'Brien asked Violet to remain in the church for a private conversation. He led her to a small chamber behind the altar where religious supplies were stored, ensuring complete privacy for their discussion. "Violet," he began gently, "I've heard that you sometimes mention things you've learned during confession sessions. Do you understand why this troubles me?" The girl looked up at him with those disconcerting, pale blue eyes. "I don't mean to tell secrets, Father. They just come out sometimes when I see things that remind me. Can you tell me what kinds of things remind you?" Violet considered the question seriously. "When I see places where bad things happened, or when I see people who remind me of the people who confessed, the words just come out. Like when I saw Herr Kellerman's bakery after he died, I couldn't stop thinking about the children in Hamburg." Father O'Brien felt his mouth go dry. "Violet, what exactly did Herr Kellerman tell you about Hamburg?" "He said he set fire to a tenement building because the children who lived there had seen him stealing money from the church collection box. He said he put oil rags under the stairs and lit them at night when everyone was sleeping. He said 6 children died, but he got away with the money and came to America. He was sorry about the children, but he said poverty made people do terrible things." The priest felt physically ill. The specific details of Violet's account, the oil rags, the location under the stairs, the motive involving church theft, had the ring of truth that could only come from direct confession. If Johann Kellerman had indeed committed mass murder in Germany, then his death in the Milwaukee River began to look less like an accident and more like justice. "Violet," Father O'Brien said carefully, "who else have you told about Herr Kellerman's confession?" "Only Mrs. Zimmermann. But I think other people know anyway because I've heard men talking about him in the taverns. They say he got what he deserved." Father O'Brien realized that Violet's knowledge was spreading through the German community like ripples in a pond. Even if she didn't intentionally reveal confessional secrets, her inadvertent comments were creating speculation and investigation that was exposing long-buried crimes. The situation was spiraling out of control, and soon it would be impossible to contain. "Violet, I want you to promise me something. Can you try very hard not to mention anything you hear during confessions? Can you try to keep those thoughts inside your mind?" The girl looked at him with an expression of genuine distress. "I try, Father. I try very hard. But sometimes the thoughts are so loud that they have to come out. It's like when you have water behind a dam, and the dam gets cracks, and the water starts leaking out even when you don't want it to." Father O'Brien understood then that Violet Mueller was not deliberately betraying confessional secrets. She was a child whose exceptional memory had become overwhelming, whose mind could no longer contain the accumulating weight of other people's sins. She was a victim of circumstance, but she was also an existential threat to everyone whose crimes she had overheard. As he walked Violet home that evening, Father O'Brien made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of protecting the girl by removing her from her translation duties, he decided to protect the parish by documenting everything she knew. If Violet's knowledge was going to surface anyway, he reasoned, it would be better to have a complete record of the information for potential use in managing the crisis. Over the following weeks, Father O'Brien began conducting what he called memory sessions with Violet. Under the guise of helping her process and forget traumatic information, he systematically extracted every detail she could remember about confessions she had translated. What he discovered was far worse than he had imagined. Violet's memory contained evidence of dozens of serious crimes: murders, arsons, thefts, assaults, child abuse, and fraud. The German immigrant community of Milwaukee's 3rd Ward was harboring men who had fled justice in Europe and who continued to commit crimes in America. The confessional booth at St. Michael's had become a repository for the sins of an entire community of fugitives. Father O'Brien filled 3 leather-bound journals with Violet's revelations, creating what amounted to a comprehensive criminal indictment of his own parish. As he wrote down each terrible detail, he began to understand why men like Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Vollmer had died. Someone else knew about Violet's knowledge and was using it to dispense a brutal form of vigilante justice. The question that haunted Father O'Brien was simple. Who else knew what Violet knew? And what would they do to protect their own secrets? The answer to Father O'Brien's question came in the form of Hans Richter, a man whose presence in Milwaukee's German community had always been both prominent and mysterious. Richter owned 3 businesses in the 3rd Ward, a brewery, a boarding house, and a meat-packing operation, and his influence extended far beyond his economic holdings. Men sought his advice on business matters, families borrowed money from him during difficult times, and even the parish council consulted him on major decisions affecting the German community. What made Richter particularly influential was his reputation as a man who could solve problems that others could not. When Wilhelm Hoffmann's teenage son was caught stealing from a rival bakery, Hans Richter negotiated a settlement that avoided both police involvement and community scandal. When the Schneider family faced eviction from their tenement, Richter provided a loan that allowed them to stay. When disputes arose between German immigrants and their Irish neighbors, Richter served as an unofficial mediator whose decisions were respected by both communities. But Hans Richter's problem-solving abilities extended into darker territories as well. Men whispered that Richter could make inconvenient people disappear, that he had connections with criminal elements in Chicago and St. Louis, and that his own past in Germany was better left unexamined. These whispers were never spoken loudly enough to reach the ears of law enforcement, but they were persistent enough to make clear that Hans Richter was not a man to cross. Richter had been notably absent from St. Michael's during the weeks following Johann Kellerman's death. His usual attendance at Sunday Mass had ceased, and he had not been seen at any of the community gatherings that typically drew his participation. When he finally reappeared in late April, his demeanor had changed dramatically. The confident, gregarious man who had been a fixture of German social life had become suspicious, watchful, and prone to private conversations in shadowy corners of taverns. Father O'Brien first realized that Richter knew about Violet's revelations when the man requested a private meeting at the church. Unlike Wilhelm Zimmermann's nervous, reluctant disclosure, Richter's approach was direct and threatening. "Father," Richter said without preamble, "we have a problem with your little translator." "I'm not sure what you mean, Hans." Richter smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I think you understand exactly what I mean. The girl knows things she shouldn't know, and she's sharing that knowledge with people who shouldn't have it." Father O'Brien tried to maintain his composure. "Violet is just a child, Hans. Sometimes children say things that don't make sense. Children who say that Heinrich Vollmer kept kidnapped children in his basement are not speaking nonsense, Father. They're speaking truth that can destroy lives and send men to prison." Richter leaned forward in his chair. "I've been to Vollmer's property. I've seen what Wilhelm Zimmermann saw. The girl's words led me there, just as they led him." The priest felt a chill of recognition. If Hans Richter had investigated Heinrich Vollmer's crimes, then he likely knew about other crimes as well. The man's absence from church suddenly made sense. He had been conducting his own investigation into Violet's revelations. "Hans, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that your translator has become a threat to the safety and prosperity of our entire community. She knows about crimes that could result in deportations, executions, and the destruction of families. This knowledge cannot be allowed to spread further." Father O'Brien realized that he was speaking not just with a concerned parishioner, but with someone who had committed crimes serious enough to justify murder to conceal them. "Are you saying that you were involved in what happened to Kellerman and the others?" Richter's expression didn't change. "I'm saying that men who commit crimes in their past sometimes find that their past catches up with them. What I'm not saying is that this process should be allowed to continue indefinitely. What do you want me to do? I want you to end the girl's translation services immediately. I want you to ensure that she understands the importance of keeping church business confidential. And I want you to make certain that no record exists of the things she has revealed. Father O'Brien thought about the 3 journals hidden in his private chambers, filled with detailed accounts of every crime Violet had described. And if I refuse? Richter stood up, adjusting his coat with deliberate care. Father, I have great respect for the church and great affection for this community. I would hate to see either damaged by unnecessary scandal or tragedy. The threat was clear without being explicit. Hans Richter was giving Father O'Brien an opportunity to solve the Violet Mueller problem quietly and voluntarily. If the priest refused, Richter would solve the problem himself. After Richter left, Father O'Brien spent hours in prayer, seeking guidance for an impossible situation. If he dismissed Violet from her translation duties, he would protect her from immediate danger, but also deprive his German parishioners of essential spiritual services. If he continued using her services, he would be placing her in mortal peril from men who had already proven willing to kill to protect their secrets. If he reported his suspicions about Richter to the police, he would be violating confessional secrecy and potentially triggering a broader investigation that could destroy the entire German community. That evening, Father O'Brien made a decision that he hoped would save Violet's life while preserving the parish. He would quietly reassign her translation duties to another member of the community, while ensuring that her family received equivalent financial compensation through other church work. The plan seemed reasonable until he attempted to implement it. When Father O'Brien approached Heinrich Mueller about ending Violet's translation services, the man's reaction was immediate and negative. The 50 cents per week that Violet earned represented nearly a quarter of the family's total income. More importantly, Heinrich viewed his daughter's work as evidence of divine favor. God had given Violet exceptional linguistic abilities, and it would be sinful to waste such a gift. Father, Heinrich said firmly, Violet wants to continue helping the church. This work is important to her, and it is important to our family. Heinrich, I'm concerned about the stress that translation work might be placing on a child her age. Perhaps she could contribute to the parish in other ways. What other ways, Father? Violet is good at translation because God made her good at translation. If you don't want her help, perhaps another parish would welcome her services. The implicit threat was clear. If Father O'Brien dismissed Violet, the Mueller family might leave St. Michael's for another German parish in Milwaukee. Heinrich would undoubtedly tell other families about his daughter's dismissal, creating speculation and gossip that could expose the very secrets Father O'Brien was trying to protect. Father O'Brien realized that he was trapped. He could not dismiss Violet without creating suspicion, but he could not continue using her without placing her in danger. His only option was to hope that Hans Richter's threats were empty and that the situation would somehow resolve itself. That hope was shattered on the morning of May 3rd, when Violet Mueller arrived at St. Michael's for her regular translation duties and found a note pinned to the confessional booth. The note, written in German, was brief and direct. Stop talking about other people's sins, or you will join them in hell. Violet brought the note to Father O'Brien, who immediately recognized both the handwriting and the implications. Hans Richter was escalating his pressure campaign, and Violet Mueller was running out of time. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Father O'Brien's hands trembled as he held the threatening note. The crude German script matched samples he had seen in Hans Richter's business correspondence, and the message's directness reflected the man's preference for solving problems through intimidation. But what troubled the priest most was not the threat itself, but the timing of its delivery. The note had been placed in the confessional booth sometime between midnight and dawn, when St. Michael's was locked and supposedly secure. This meant that Hans Richter possessed keys to the church, or that he had accomplices among the parish staff, or that his influence extended even deeper into the community than Father O'Brien had realized. The violation of sacred space represented an escalation that suggested Richter was prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to silence Violet Mueller. Father O'Brien made an immediate decision that would prove to be both wise and tragically insufficient. He summoned Heinrich Mueller to the church that afternoon and showed him the threatening note, explaining that his daughter's safety required immediate action. "Heinrich," the priest said urgently, "you must take Violet away from Milwaukee. Today, this very evening." Heinrich studied the note with growing alarm. As a German immigrant who had fled political persecution in his homeland, he understood the deadly seriousness of written threats. "Where should we go, Father?" "Take her to Chicago. I have contacts at St. Alphonsus Parish who can provide temporary shelter while you find work. Tell no one where you're going, and don't return until I send word that it's safe." Heinrich nodded grimly. "What about Greta? She's too sick to travel." "Leave Greta with the Zimmermans. Wilhelm and Brunhilde will care for her until she's well enough to join you. The important thing is to get Violet out of Milwaukee before whoever wrote this note decides to take more direct action." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the Third Ward, Heinrich Mueller packed a small bag with his daughter's belongings and prepared for their departure. Violet seemed to understand the gravity of the situation without being told the full details. Her usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness that made her appear older than her 12 years. "Papa," she said as they prepared to leave their tenement on Huron Street, "are we leaving because of the things I said about the men who died?" Heinrich knelt down to meet his daughter's gaze. "Violet, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes adults do bad things, and when children know about those bad things, it can be dangerous for the children. We're leaving to keep you safe. Will we come back?" "Someday, Liebchen, when it's safe." Father O'Brien had arranged for Wilhelm Zimmermann to drive the Muellers to the train station in his brewery wagon, concealing them among barrels and grain sacks to avoid observation. The plan was simple. Heinrich and Violet would take the evening train to Chicago, where Father McKenna at St. Alphonsus Parish would provide sanctuary until permanent arrangements could be made. The plan failed because Hans Richter had anticipated it. As Wilhelm's wagon approached the Milwaukee Road depot, 3 men emerged from the shadows near the platform. Richter himself stood in the center, flanked by 2 associates whom Wilhelm recognized as employees from Richter's meatpacking operation. All 3 men carried walking sticks that could easily serve as weapons. "Good evening, Wilhelm," Richter said pleasantly. "Lovely night for travel." Wilhelm pulled his wagon to a stop, his mind racing for alternatives. The train station was too public for violence, but it was also too isolated for help if Richter decided to act. "Good evening, Hans. Just delivering some supplies to the depot warehouse." Richter approached the wagon with casual confidence. "I think you're delivering something more valuable than supplies, Wilhelm. I think you're delivering the little translator who's been causing so much trouble for our community." From beneath the grain sacks, Violet's muffled voice could be heard. "He burned the church records, Papa. He burned the confession records so no one would know about the money he stole from the poor box." The words hit Richter like a physical blow. His casual demeanor vanished, replaced by cold fury. "Get them out of the wagon, now." Wilhelm realized that resistance was futile. Richter's associates were younger and stronger, and they had chosen the location carefully to avoid witnesses. With deep reluctance, he helped Heinrich and Violet climb down from their hiding place among the barrels. Richter studied Violet with the calculating expression of a butcher evaluating livestock. "So you're the little girl who remembers everything. Tell me, child, what else do you remember about me?" Violet looked up at him with those unsettling pale blue eyes. "You confessed to Father O'Brien about killing your brother in Hamburg to steal his papers. You said you needed his identity to come to America because the police were looking for you. You said you pushed him into the harbor and told everyone he was drunk and fell in. You said you were sorry, but you couldn't go to prison. Richter's face went white. The confession Violet described had taken place during his first week in Milwaukee, more than 4 years earlier. It was information that could not only destroy his reputation and businesses, but also result in his deportation and execution in Germany. "You've heard enough confessions, little translator," Richter said quietly. "It's time for you to make your own." What happened next would be debated by investigators for decades. Wilhelm Zimmermann later testified that Richter grabbed Violet by the arm and began dragging her toward the river that ran behind the train station. Heinrich Mueller shouted for help and attempted to intervene, only to be struck down by one of Richter's associates. Violet screamed, and her screams could be heard by passengers waiting on the platform. But Violet Mueller's fate was sealed not by Hans Richter's violence, but by her own extraordinary memory. As Richter dragged her toward the water, she began reciting every crime she had ever heard him confess. She spoke of murders in Hamburg, thefts in Milwaukee, bribes paid to police officers, and threats made against rivals. She recited dates, names, locations, and methods with the precision of a court stenographer. "Stop talking," Richter shouted, but Violet could not stop. The trauma of the moment had triggered the same psychological mechanism that had caused her to blurt out confessional secrets in casual conversation. Under extreme stress, her mind released its accumulated burden of criminal knowledge in a flood of specific, damning details. Train passengers and depot workers heard fragments of Violet's recitation. They heard her describe Hans Richter as a murderer and a thief. They heard her detail crimes that painted him as one of the most dangerous men in Milwaukee's German community. And they heard her final words before Richter's hand closed around her throat. "You killed them all because they knew about the stolen money. You killed Kellerman and Brenner and Steinberg and Vollmer because I told people what they confessed. But you can't kill everyone who knows your secrets because God knows your secrets too." Hans Richter silenced Violet Mueller that night beside the Milwaukee River, but he could not silence the truth she had spoken. Too many people had heard too much of her final testimony. Within hours, Milwaukee police were searching for Richter, guided by witness accounts of the crimes Violet had described. Within days, investigations were underway into the deaths of Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Vollmer. Within weeks, evidence had been uncovered that corroborated many of Violet's claims. Hans Richter was never captured. He disappeared from Milwaukee on the night of Violet's death, leaving behind his businesses, his properties, and his carefully constructed identity. Some said he fled to California, others believed he returned to Germany. A few whispered that he had been killed by other members of the German community, who blamed him for bringing unwanted attention to their secrets. Heinrich Mueller survived the attack, but was left with permanent injuries that ended his career as a cooper. He spent the rest of his life seeking justice for his daughter's murder, writing letters to police departments across the country and hiring private investigators to track down Hans Richter. He never found the man who killed Violet, but his efforts kept the case alive in public memory long after official investigations had been closed. The death of Violet Mueller sent shockwaves through Milwaukee's German community that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of a child's murder. In the weeks following her death, as police investigations uncovered evidence supporting many of her final revelations, the community began to understand the full scope of what they had lost. Father O'Brien, devastated by his failure to protect Violet, made a decision that would define the remainder of his career. He took the 3 journals containing Violet's confessional revelations and delivered them personally to the Milwaukee Police Department, despite the canonical violations this action represented. His testimony provided investigators with detailed information about dozens of unsolved crimes, leading to arrests, convictions, and the exposure of a criminal network that had operated within the German immigrant community for years. The priest's cooperation with police earned him censure from church authorities, but gratitude from law enforcement. Detective Captain Michael Donahue, who led the investigation into Violet's death, later wrote that Father O'Brien's journals represented the most comprehensive criminal intelligence ever provided by a single source in the history of Milwaukee law enforcement. The journals revealed that the German immigrant community of the Third Ward had harbored an extraordinary concentration of fugitives from European justice, men who had committed murders, arsons, thefts, and assaults in Germany, had fled to America and assumed new identities, believing that their crimes would remain buried in the past. The confessional booth at St. Michael's had become an inadvertent repository for evidence of these crimes, with Violet Mueller serving as an unwitting witness to decades of criminal confession. Wilhelm Zimmermann, who had witnessed Violet's final moments, became the primary witness in the case against Hans Richter. His testimony helped investigators understand how Richter had systematically eliminated men whose confessed crimes had been compromised by Violet's revelations. The murders of Kellerman, Brenner, Steinberg, and Vollmer were reclassified as homicides, with Richter identified as the primary suspect in all 4 cases. The investigation also revealed the economic motives behind Richter's crimes. As owner of multiple businesses in the Third Ward, Richter had profited enormously from the criminal activities of his fellow immigrants. He had provided money laundering services for stolen goods, offered false identification documents for fugitives, and operated protection rackets that extorted payments from men whose criminal pasts made them vulnerable to blackmail. Violet's revelations had threatened not just individual criminals, but an entire underground economy that Richter had built and controlled. Brunhilde Zimmermann, who had first heard Violet's disturbing revelations about Johann Kellerman, spent years documenting the girl's story for historical preservation. Her detailed account, written in German and later translated into English, became the primary source for understanding how Violet's exceptional memory had transformed her from an innocent child into an existential threat to criminal fugitives. She was just a little girl who remembered everything, Mrs. Zimmermann wrote. In a different time and place, her gift would have made her a scholar or a teacher. But in our community at that time, her memory made her the most dangerous person in Milwaukee. The case had lasting effects on Catholic confession practices in immigrant communities across America. Church authorities developed new protocols for translation services requiring adult interpreters and implementing safeguards to protect confessional secrecy. The Milwaukee Protocol, as it became known, was adopted by parishes nationwide to prevent similar tragedies. St. Michael's Church continued to serve the German community, but it never again employed child translators for confession services. A small memorial plaque near the church's entrance commemorates Violet Mueller as a child whose innocence was lost in service to God's mercy. The plaque, installed by Father O'Brien shortly before his retirement, includes a quote from Scripture, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Heinrich Mueller never remarried after his wife Greta died of pneumonia 6 months after Violet's death. He spent his remaining years working as a night watchman and continuing his futile search for Hans Richter. His final letter to the Milwaukee Police Department, written shortly before his death in 1891, expressed his belief that Richter was still alive and still dangerous. A man who could kill a child to protect his secrets will never stop running from those secrets. Detective Captain Donahue, who investigated the case until his retirement in 1895, remained convinced that Hans Richter had established a new identity somewhere in the American West. "Men like Richter don't just disappear," he wrote in his memoirs. "They reinvent themselves and continue their predatory behavior in new locations." Somewhere in America, there's probably a businessman or community leader who was once Hans Richter of Milwaukee, and he's probably still exploiting vulnerable people to protect his secrets. The case file on Violet Mueller's murder remained open until 1920, when Milwaukee police finally declared Hans Richter legally dead. By that time, all the principal witnesses had died, and the trail had grown too cold to follow. But the case had established important precedents for investigating crimes within immigrant communities and had demonstrated the value of protecting witnesses who possessed dangerous knowledge. Modern criminologists who have studied the case note that Violet Mueller was essentially the victim of an early form of witness elimination. Her death represented a calculated attempt to silence someone whose testimony could have exposed widespread criminal activity. The fact that she was a child made her particularly vulnerable, but it also made her testimony particularly credible to the investigators who later pursued the case. The basement of Heinrich Vollmer's former tavern, where Violet had claimed children were imprisoned and abused, was thoroughly excavated by police in the months following her death. The investigation confirmed the existence of restraints, bloodstains, and other evidence supporting Violet's claims. The discovery led to the identification of several missing children and the prosecution of surviving members of Vollmer's criminal network. In a final, haunting twist to the case, workers demolishing the building in 1923 discovered a hidden compartment containing detailed records of Vollmer's crimes. The documents, written in German, included names, dates, and financial transactions related to child trafficking. Among the papers was a letter addressed to Hans Richter, confirming their business partnership and detailing profit-sharing arrangements for their criminal enterprises. This discovery, made more than 50 years after Violet's death, provided final confirmation of the accuracy of her revelations. The 12-year-old girl, who had been dismissed by some as a fantasist or attention seeker, had been telling the truth about crimes so horrible that adults could barely comprehend them. The story of Violet Mueller serves as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability, and that the most vulnerable members of society, children, immigrants, the poor, are often the only witnesses to crimes that powerful people desperately want to conceal. Her memory, which should have been a gift, became a curse that cost her life. But her courage in speaking truth, even under the most terrifying circumstances, helped expose a network of criminals who might otherwise have continued their predatory behavior indefinitely. This mystery shows us how quickly innocence can become dangerous when it threatens the secrets that evil men will kill to protect. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.